So hello, I'm happy to have Dawn Comstock with me. She is a professor at the Department for Epidemiology, Injury Prevention Center in Colorado. And basically, she authored the most cited paper in 2012 in the AJSM journal. And the title was The Epidemiology of Concussion Among United States High School Athletes in 20 Different Sports. So Dawn, very interesting paper to look at it now 10 years ago, and I think it was a groundbreaking paper. What was your motivation at that time to write this study?
Concussions in youth sports were becoming a topic of interest. It was the right time. I happened to have the data with the high school Rio surveillance system that I had, but really the motivation behind this paper was the first author. I'm the senior author on that paper, but the first author, Malika Marar, was a high school student who was doing a high school summer research project so that she could participate in a scholarship program they had here in the United States at the time called the Young Epidemiology Scholars Program. So a high school student came, wanted to do a research project, was interested in sports-related concussions, and we had the data. So it was a paper we wanted to write anyway, but it was written at that specific time because of the interest of a high school student who, by the way, was quite upset when she did not win the first place prize. She did win a prize in the national competition, but she did not win first place. I think she's over that now, now that she's actually in the medical career, the medical profession, and she sees how many citations she's gotten from that publication.
Great. I mean, and the high school athletes, very young patients or young athletes at the end of the day. What were the findings you took out of this study?
That was really the time when the United States was intensifying its interest in sports-related concussions in general, but particularly among younger athletes. And we were able to use the high school Rio data, a large national surveillance system of high school aged athletes here in the United States, about 14 to 18 years of age, and look at injury rates and patterns and outcomes in those athletes and compare it to some collegiate athlete data from the NCAA's injury surveillance system. So what we found in that paper, what we reported was not surprising now when you look back at it, but at the time, it was the first time a lot of this was being published. Rates varied widely by sport. Contact sports had the highest rate of concussion, followed by sports where contact is largely against the rules of the game, but frequently occurs. Sports like basketball, sports like soccer, football. And then the lowest rates were in sports where contact rarely occurs. When we looked at gender comparable sports, sports that boys and girls play by the same rules, we found consistently that girls had higher rates of concussion than boys. And we postulated two potential hypotheses, that there were some biophysiological differences that meant that young female athletes were truly at higher risk of sustaining a concussion, or some sociocultural motivators that may lead young female athletes to report symptoms while young male athletes might try to hide them, or even that the coaches or parents of young female athletes might be a little more protective and a little more on the lookout. So yeah, really looking differences by sport, differences by gender, and then of course some really interesting differences across the age continuum, that collegiate athletes often had higher rates of concussion, but because there are so many more high school athletes in the United States, the number of concussions was much, much higher in that younger age group.
What I also find interesting, besides the females, was the return to sports. I mean, I think you picked it out. Most of them kind of went back to sports the same day.
Yes, unfortunately. At that point in the United States, we were just at the cusp of individual states passing state level concussion legislation and different sports governing bodies really starting to develop and adopt concussion return protocols. And yeah, far, far too many. In fact, the very first paper that we ever published with High School Rio data on concussions was published a few years before this one. But at that time, we had return to play information, but the variable that we used in the surveillance system didn't ask about coming back the same day, because our definition of injury at that point was a time loss injury. So we actually, after that first paper was published and so many neurologists and pediatric concussion specialists asked us, what about the kids that come back the same day? We actually changed our surveillance system so that we could capture those concussions where the young athletes were returning the same day so that we could look at it. And this paper was the first paper where we really reported that same day return. And yeah, it was ridiculous. When you look back at the paper now, I mean, goodness gracious, at the huge percentage of particularly American football players that return to play the same day after sustaining a concussion. I'm really happy to say that I think there's been a lot of change, and that's much more of a rarity now.
I mean, you kind of had a big impact in starting that change, and when you even ended up in the White House and working in this within the last years. What's your idea of what developed within the last 10 years? Where are we now? Where has the development been?
Yeah, the international concussion meetings that have been held and the consensus statements that have been released, the fact that the international concussion consensus statements are published at the same time by multiple journals, I think that shows just how important this topic has been and just how committed everyone in the field of sports medicine has been to try to address this topic. It's been satisfying to see so many policy organizations, leadership organizations really try to make rule changes, from the top level international organizations like FIFA, et cetera, all the way down to local rec sports leagues. The fact that they think about concussions and they realize the need to develop concussion return protocols. There's a whole generation of sports medicine professionals who specialize in concussion now that just they weren't even in med school when this paper was published. So just seeing the growth in the field, seeing so many other researchers from labs, people much, much, much smarter than me and my team who have just, the field has just expanded and the depth of knowledge is so great now. This paper was important at its time because it was the first data to really draw attention to the problem. And then once those eyes, became aware, once people became aware of the problem, oh man, it's just amazing to see the advancements in care, the advancements in diagnostics, the advancements in just the understanding of this injury and the importance of this injury. But yeah, the day at the White House was a pretty fun day.
Yeah, and I think, that's paper is a great example for how we can really change something with science. Now rules have changed, and I think the concussion topic is really a topic where we made really steps forward because we were able to change the rules, protect the kids more, and really prevent it. In other areas, in the orthopedic area, ACL injuries, etc., we are, I think, not so far yet, but this is really a nice area where science brought something to rolling, going on.
As clinical researchers, as epidemiologists, I think we flatter ourselves if we think that our work after it's published in a journal is read by more than maybe a couple thousand people. So I think one of the reasons why this paper was important at its time was because it made news, it made national news. News organizations picked it up and talked about it. Organizations like the National Federation of State High School Athletic Associations, their rules committee and their sports medicine committee talked about it. Professional organizations like this organization started talking about this research, and the research was only important because there were so many people that put it into action. That's what drove the change. It wasn't the research itself. It was the people that used it to drive action. All of the sporting organizations that use this and other research to drive action. That's what made the change, not the research itself. I think it was a good lesson for me, and hopefully a take-home lesson for all of us in our fields, that we aren't done when the paper's accepted, we aren't done. That's when we need to find a way to translate that important information into action. We just have to get it into the hands of the right people that can drive that action.
That's perfect. I mean, that's a perfect closing word for our short interview. Thank you so much for taking the time, for being part of our countdown. And it was very interesting to talk to you. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.